Our first panel. My name is Kevin Walsh. I'm a professor here at the law school, and I am pleased to introduce our panel on state-level school finance. Of course, in our traditional con law course, our main diet focuses on separation of powers, federalism, individual rights, and we've already heard from the federal level. This panel moves us to the state level, although as we see, things are not easily separable. Our first speaker today is Molly Hunter. Ms. Hunter is the Director for Education Justice at the Education Law Center, offering nationwide assistance really to their network of education advocates. And she has litigated these cases, including an important case out of New York, and now is working with a nationwide network. We have, after Ms. Hunter, is David Hinojosa, who joins us from Texas. He's the National Director of Policy for the Intercultural Development Research Association, and again has litigated many of these cases. So here we are in Virginia, hearing from, we've got New Jersey, New York, Texas, California, and then our third speaker is our own Kimberly Robinson, Professor of Law here, and Professor Robinson's a national expert on the federal role in education. And Professor Robinson, like our other panelists, gets results. The last time that there was a school, sort of an education panel, it led to a book, which is being launched this afternoon. And so we will hear from the panelists for about 7 minutes each. I'll have a few questions, and then we'll open it up to you all, looking to wrap up about 11:10. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin, and thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. Given our brief time together, I just want to jump right in. At the Education Law Center, we work on requiring states to offer a quality education to all students. And one of the key questions that arises in that work is what level of opportunity meets the constitutional standard? And in this context, it's the state constitutional standards. So I'll be brief, and I'll give a little historical background, and then I'll very much look forward to the discussion. So a high school laboratory science course was required to graduate from high school in New York State, but 31 high schools in New York City had no science lab. In Kansas, the school districts with the most minority students, the most low-income students, and the most students with disabilities were actually getting the least per-pupil funding from the state. In South Carolina, in 8 rural, mostly minority districts, teacher turnover rates exceeded 20% each and every year, and graduation rates ranged between 33% and 57%. Given these kinds of facts, it's not the least bit surprising that right now there are 14 states defending themselves in cases claiming that their school finance systems are unconstitutional under their own state constitutions. These facts, these inequities and inadequacies underlay the poor outcomes that we see because they really restrict the opportunities. Now, in those cases, plaintiffs have been winning these so-called adequacy cases, or educational opportunity cases, or school finance cases, many different terms. The plaintiffs have been winning most of the decisions, including recent decisions in New Mexico on a motion to dismiss, in South Carolina at the Supreme Court level on the liability issue, in Texas at the trial court level, and in Washington State at the Supreme Court level. Now, a little background. In the 70s and 80s, a lot of these cases, school finance cases, were brought looking for equal per-pupil funding. But the states won about 2/3 of those cases. Beginning in 1989, the plaintiffs have been winning a large majority of the cases, and part of that change in result is because of a shift in the legal theory, the legal strategy, shifting to cases based on the state constitutional education clauses. and shifting to, is the education that students are being offered adequate under that clause? So it also led some of the states who had found for defendants in the earlier cases to distinguish these adequacy cases and come to a different result. So all 50 state constitutions, as you may know, have education articles. Some are stronger and others weaker, but they're all there. Many of those were adopted. Some were adopted in the late 18th century when the nation was founded. They require legislators and governors to do things such as cherish learning. The deeply held belief behind those provisions was that knowledge and civic virtue, meaning involvement in your democracy yourself, were essential to the preservation of freedom and individual rights and the preservation of a republican form of government. The courts love this kind of history when they're interpreting a provision in a constitution, so the history behind these provisions is key. So many states actually adopted these provisions in the late 19th century in response to what was called the Common School movement. It sought equal educational opportunity for the new immigrants, the children of new immigrants, and workers in a mixed industrial and agricultural age. So I'll quote the delegates at the Kentucky Constitutional Convention of 1891. Quote, "The boys of the humble mountain home stand equally high with those from the mansions of the city. There are no distinction in the common schools, but all stand upon one level." So that epitomized the egalitarian ideals of the common school movement. So we don't learn much about this, at least I didn't, in American history, but there was actually an intense political struggle around this movement, and opponents said that it could give rise to feudal aspirations for those born to inferior positions, and that class distinctions made for social cohesion. Nonetheless, the movement prevailed. And I want to quote one more constitutional convention in New York in 1894. "Whatever may have been the school's value heretofore, their importance for the future cannot be overestimated. The public problems confronting the rising generation will demand accurate knowledge and the highest development of reasoning power more than ever before." Well, I think that rings equally true today and will going forward. So these education articles and their history provide very important grounds for legal advocacy on behalf of low-income and minority students, students learning English, those with disabilities, to secure them those opportunities and knowledge and reasoning power that the Constitutional Convention talked about, that they need to succeed in this day and age. So while school funding adequacy cases find solid footing on those provisions, there have been developments on the education side that are very helpful for plaintiffs to be able to build evidence of a constitutional violation. So during the last 25 years, all states have developed educational standards, learning standards, academic standards, and broadly speaking, the standards are intended to reflect what students need to know and be able to do to be civic participants and competitive workers in this century. So for our context, the standards articulate modern, detailed, substantive goals of education. And the courts then can apply these standards to constitutional clauses and require a thorough, those clauses might require a thorough and efficient education, suitable education, but they can apply those standards, and it helps them do their analysis in face of plaintiffs' evidence. So states, states do try to align their curriculum, their teacher prep, and so on with the standards, but very few states have tried to align their funding systems with the standards. So the adequacy cases challenge them to do that. That's the point, is to align with the standards and provide the opportunity for all students to reach the standards. So I have lots of examples, and I just don't have any time. So I do look forward to the discussion, and I think you'll get some more specifics from David. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I really want to give a shout out to the Richmond Law Review and Joseph for really being great host. I come from San Antonio in Texas, where we're known for our southern hospitality, and I travel all this way, and I was like, oh, wait a second, I still am in the South, right? So really appreciate you extending your courtesies here. My name is David Hinojosa. I'm the National Director of Policy and the Director of the South Central Collaborative for Equity at IDRA, which many people aren't too sure about IDRA, don't know much about IDRA, but we've been around since 1973. In fact, we were founded immediately following the San Antonio ISD versus Rodriguez case because our founder had figured out, wait a second, there's a lot of research, there's a lot of data that is needed to help shine the light on these inequities. There's a lot of policy work that needs to be done on these inequities. There's a lot of litigation support that needs to be done to ensure that all students have access to equal educational opportunities. And so I moved over from MALDEF, where I was the Southwest Regional Counsel and the lead counsel on the most recent Texas school finance case, as well as most of the major education cases that we did there. And today I want to talk to you about what we call the fourth wave or fourth generation school finance cases. So Molly had mentioned before, about kind of these different waves, and I'll just brush over these. The first wave was essentially based on the Federal Equal Protection Clause under the U.S. Constitution, and it was largely brought by either poor districts or poor students in certain districts or minority students in certain districts, alleging that their rights to equal protection under the U.S. Constitution were being violated because they were receiving substantially less resources or fewer resources than other districts. Of course, the Rodriguez case kind of slammed the door shut on that by denying education as a fundamental right under the U.S. Constitution and failing to recognize poor districts as a protected class under the U.S. Constitution, essentially. So, of course, we were directed by Justice Marshall to go pursue these actions in the state courts. And so that's where they had started doing the state equal protection claims, and also based on the education clauses, the state education clauses under the various constitutions. And those were largely based, again, on, well, we're property poor districts, look at us, we only receive X amount of dollars, versus the wealthier districts or the districts concentrated with fewer minority students in them. And then, of course, what happened in California in the Serrano case was that they did find a violation, of the Equal Protection Clause in the state. But what ended up happening was they ended up leveling down the system. They didn't level up the system. And so there was a recognition that, wait a second, we need to also talk not just about equity and equality, but we also need to talk about adequacy. And so now these adequacy cases were trying to be brought and said, okay, well, if students are required to achieve at a certain standard, or they're required, or even greater society is calling them to achieve a certain standard, whether to enter the college and career readiness, whether to achieve the state standards, or whether it's to simply be, better prepared and informed U.S. citizens, then we need to make sure that we address that. And I'm going to talk briefly about the Texas Taxpayer and Student Fairness Coalition, because I want to talk about a couple of other cases that fit more with the fourth wave. But I wanted to talk about this briefly because a lot of people always say, oh, it didn't come out so great. But why are you back in court? You've been in court 6 times, since the 1980s in Texas, which frankly isn't very many times if you talk about other laws that are, sued under. But nevertheless, and the real problem piece in this is because when you, and this is an IDRA analysis, when you break out the districts by decile, so it's 1,024 districts in Texas. We love everything big in Texas and the number of districts that we have. So if you break them out into deciles, it's 102 districts per decile. So the wealthiest decile has a property value of over $1 million. The poorest decile has $76,000 per pupil. So obviously, this accordion has to kind of shrink, because if you were just to base funding on property, values and property wealth, of course you would have these stark inequalities. And so that's where, the rub happens. Now all of a sudden you have to, bring the wealthy districts down because, of course, Texas doesn't want to bring everybody up all the way. And so we end up having these equalizing, controversial to the wealthy districts and the people in the wealthy districts about recapturing their funds. But what this means even more so when you look at the gap, because even when they try to crunch everything, of course, equal can never be equal, right? Even our the state Supreme Court said, well, we're not talking about equality, we're just talking about substantial equality. And what that means is that there's at least a $1,000 gap between the wealthiest and poorest districts. And what that means for the classrooms in the poorest districts, they get $140,000 versus $167,000 in the wealthiest districts. And mind you, the demographics of these are very different between the two. But $27,000 is a heck of a lot of money for one classroom, right? And what ends up happening is, well, Texas says, well, we want all students to graduate college and career ready. Well, we're right with them. That's great. We need to have strong standards. But what ends up happening is that when we look at how students are scored, so the far left is the Texas average. So 63% of the kids are taking the SAT. Only 25% are measuring at the college and career ready. It's even worse for African Americans who have a higher participation rate on the SAT, but only 8%. 1 out of 12 African American students who wants to take the SAT, who wants to go to college, is being prepared to go to college. Hispanics is at 12%. Asian Americans 53%, and whites is at 42%. And I'm really not going to have much time to go over the cases that I really wanted to. I didn't realize that. But in New Mexico, it's an incredibly comprehensive lawsuit. I encourage you to look at this lawsuit because it's not just about funding. It took us 2 years to investigate this case. And what continuously came back to us was, well, it's not just about the funding, David. It's not just about funding. We need to, attack some of these other inequalities built into the system. So yes, there are adequacy claims brought on behalf of low-income and English learner students and special education students. There's also this push. We want to establish education as a fundamental right under the New Mexico Constitution. That has never been established in a case, and we want to do that. But we also want to look at what does a sufficient education under the New Mexico Constitution mean? Well, it certainly should mean that students are prepared to achieve the state standards, the state expectations, so that's going to include that. But it also means in multicultural education. And the state of New Mexico has a unique constitution that requires schools to provide Spanish, for example. There's a lot of Native American and Spanish heritage built into the expectations as well. So we believe that is part and parcel to a sufficient education. We also want to make sure that you don't just dole out the money to districts. We think the state has a duty to monitor the expenditures of districts. And of course, we don't represent districts in this lawsuit. We only represented parents and school children. They might not be too fond of that provision. But we also attack the teacher evaluations that have been implemented. They use 50% of a student's test score to evaluate a teacher. There's all sorts of problems with the research on value-added measures and whether or not those are accurate. And so we've attacked, not necessarily saying this is the teacher evaluation method that you have to engage in, but certainly where they've gone is actually through that, with the teacher evaluation system and with the school grading and accountability system, what you have is these factors that actually end up driving high quality teachers away from high need students. And that certainly can't mean that the state is fulfilling its duty to provide a sufficient education. Lastly, I'm going to brush real quickly. I know I'm over my time, and I'll be sure to not participate so much in the discussion perhaps. But this is an incredible case filed by the UNC Center for Civil Rights in North Carolina. And once again, these are school finance plus cases. It's grounded in the state education clause saying that a sound basic education must be provided, but the Halifax County Board of Schools, who oversees this tripartite school district system, has created these school district boundaries that are largely based on race. And so you see these funky little, gerrymandering of these district lines kind of circling around these majority black neighborhoods, and you have 3 districts that are controlled by the same county, and they have 95% black in one district, 85% black in another district, 25% black in the third district. And so you have all these differences in funding, facilities, teacher quality, discipline, substantial inequalities. You have sewage breaking out in some of these majority black schools, ceiling tiles falling with mold from the ceilings. Meanwhile, the schools in the white majority district are very substantial. And what's worse is that all this leads to the stigmatization of the kids going in those schools. Similar to what Assistant Secretary Lehman was talking about this morning, similar to what was found in Brown v. Board. I mean, the social science research speaks volumes in this area. And when those kids are going to those schools and being treated in that manner, you can't expect students. I mean, there's going to be a lot of survivors. There are going to be a lot of exceptions in the system. But largely, you have this defeatist attitude. You have this defeatist system. And so they've challenged this. And what was worse was, you have the 9-year-old Larry Silver who wonders aloud to his mother why he has to attend the worst school and why he cannot go to the school with textbooks that they can actually take home because they don't have those in the black school district, and with new buildings. That should not be happening in the year 2015, but it is. And these people and these communities have tried to challenge this in the legislature, have tried to challenge this in very government entities, but they've had the door closed. The whole notion of education is a great equalizer, that's a false notion for many of these kids, and it shouldn't be, and these lawsuits help them at least advocate for their rights and give them a chance at least for opportunity in their schools. So thank you very much.
All right, good morning. So I'm going to talk this morning about what the federal government could do to help to influence and encourage state funding systems to be more equitable and to better serve all children. So just to give you sort of one snapshot of how funding systems are currently inequitable, if you look at a recent national study, this was published in 2015, I encourage you to take a look at it. It actually is out of Molly Hunter's shop. Is school funding fair? And it looks at 4 different funding measures. I'm just going to mention one of them to get you a sense of how school funding systems are structured. So 14 states have regressive funding systems. So what does that mean? That means the students that research shows have the greatest needs, low-income students, often students with disability, concentration of poverty, those children get less in the state funding system. And the research is very clear that it often takes more funding to educate those children to reach state standards, yet 14 states consistently give those children less money. You have 19 states that have essentially flat funding systems. Flat meaning they don't differentiate based on the amount of poverty or other student needs within the district. And then you have 15 states that are progressive. So they actually are states which take a look at whether students of poverty are in the school and provide additional resources to those students to recognize the resources that they do need additional funding. So this is sort of just one indicator that as a nation across the country, we have challenges within school funding systems that result in students not getting the resources that they need. And the litigation that was talked about is one of the ways that that is challenging these disparities and seeks to remedy them in some kind of systemic manner. However, one of the difficulties with focusing and relying on state measures is some states have simply said this is left to the full discretion of the legislature. We are in one of those states today. We are in Virginia, and the Virginia Supreme Court has said very clearly that it is up to the legislature and the sole discretion of the legislature to decide what children should receive in terms of the funding formula. It was given to the legislature in the state constitution, and the Supreme Court will not second-guess that. Their decisions. And so the challenge with state-by-state litigation of these disparities is that many children, including those in Virginia, are left without remedies to address when the funding formula, either one, is inequitable, two, hasn't been updated in many years, which is true in the case of Virginia. It needs to have a new kind of costing out study of what is needed to educate the children. And so often you have this very disparate map of students who have a robust right. For example, in New Jersey, the Abbott decisions have required the state legislature to cost out what it would cost to educate all children to the state standards, and to look at the disparate needs of children, not just sort of an equal basis, but we recognize, and the research is very clear, that different children have different needs to accomplish the outcomes that we want in state standards, and so we need to recognize that in state funding formulas. And so my most recent research, and as well as a chapter in my new book, talks about the fact that I think one of the things that we have not considered as we look at disparities in education opportunity and why they persist and why they are so deeply entrenched in our country is our understanding of education federalism. So when I tell people I write and research about education federalism, sometimes their eyes glaze over and they think, that doesn't sound very interesting. But really what it is about is who's in charge of education, who is overseeing education. And the United States has been for generations focused on ensuring state and local control of education. There has been, in recent decades, a substantial increase in federal involvement in education. And yet even that, what my research shows is even that increase in the federal role in education has been limited because of what it is understood in the United States that the federal government can do and can speak to. So many things have been off the table. Federal standards for education, definitely very taboo. Any idea of federal standards for teachers, also not permitted except the very baseline levels that were permitted in No Child Left Behind. And so what my work argues is that we need to disrupt our understanding of education federalism and consider moving toward a research-based understanding of which levels of government should do what. There's enough of a track record of what the federal government has done in education to understand what they do well and what they do not do well. And some of the things that they do well is they prioritize for the country equal educational opportunity and access to educational resources. And that is one thing that, unfortunately, the states across the United States have not consistently done. You do have some states that prioritize that, but most of them do not. And so what I argue for is with a disruption of our approach to education federalism that is willing to change what the federal role in education is and to embrace the many strengths that the federal government has in education policymaking. That includes not only prioritizing equal education opportunity, that includes supporting research on the best approaches to ensure that includes distributing financial assistance to address the disparate capacities of states to fund education, that includes technical assistance to states to look at their formulas and how they could be more equitable. There's much the federal government can do to support more equitable funding systems, but unfortunately our notion of federalism sort of tells them to stay hands-off. And when Secretary Lehman said that the department has been criticized for the guidance she has issued, that was a understatement. They've been hotly criticized for the ways that they have focused on ensuring equal access to education along lines of race, color, disability, national origin. And again, I would argue that's due to federalism. No, the federal government shouldn't be telling us how to run our schools. They shouldn't have a role in that. And I think it is that notion that keeps us from drawing upon the strengths of federal policymaking while leaving to the states and localities what they do best. So my most recent work is focusing on, and I welcome questions about this during Q&A, so my most recent work is, should there be a federal role in funding, in how schools are funded, and in influencing the states to ensure equal access to an excellent education? And so my research focuses on, what if we were going to consider what an effective federal influence on state funding systems would be. What would that look like? How could the federal government harness its resources to encourage states to give all students equal access to an excellent education? So what I do in my research is pull together what are the key challenges and inequities in state funding systems, and then what principles should the federal government require states to honor when they are designing their funding systems and when they are evaluating their funding systems. So I'll just quickly sketch some possibilities and tell you where I'm landing, and then I welcome your questions about it. So of course there's the possibility of a federal mandate that simply just says the states must do X or Y. I think that would be unlikely given our system of education federalism, and also I think it would be a difficult one to enforce, in part because of the wide variations between the states. You also could have, on the opposite spectrum, a more incentive-based structure. We've seen the federal government actually do some fairly effective incentives through Race to the Top, and we've seen substantial education reform because of the large sums of money that the federal government dangled in front of the states to get them to adopt certain reforms. However, I think when we were dealing with state funding systems, and particularly a question earlier about the local nature of funding and how that is in substantial part based on property taxes, I don't think incentives where you can opt in or opt out of the system would be sufficient. So what I propose in my work is I really think that the federal government, given that in 2013 it distributed $54.4 billion for K-12 education, I think that that amount of money should come with some strings attached that require state funding systems to be more equitable. So I'll just mention a few of the principles I'm considering in my research, and I'm still refining these currently. So first, I think that the primary goal requires that you should have equal access to an excellent education. And the question is, how do you get there? Sort of what do you do? I think in part, one of the things the school finance cases have done well is they've revealed the irrationality of state funding systems. Funding systems, oftentimes, you find in depositions, how did you reach the funding system? Well, we looked at the budget, we said we had this much to allocate for education, we then bargained over who got what, and that's how we divided it up. Well, did you take a look at sort of what it would cost to educate the children to the standards that you hold them to? No, that was not our consideration. That was not what we were doing. We were dividing up the pot that we had, we bargained over who got what, and that is how schools are funded. That is not it's a politically driven approach to funding, but it's not an effective way to ensure that we get excellent outcomes. So this is why we have some of the challenges we have. And so I believe the department should insist that states not only identify the goals of their funding system, but then show how their funding system is closely tied to achieving that. I think that the federal government also should require states to monitor and assess that their funding system, even if they did that kind of analysis, make sure they monitor both the effectiveness, the efficiency, and any kind of waste within the system, misappropriation of funds, and also that the system is reviewed periodically to make sure that it continues to achieve the goals that the citizens of the state define as their objective. But I think as a nation, we should no longer be tolerating the distribution of federal money without some requirement that there's equal access to an education for all students. Thank you.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists. We have plenty of time to actually address some of the questions that were raised. I think the first question I'd like to direct to our first two speakers is this. I mean, one of the things, Molly, you said was that plaintiffs have been winning these cases and for decades, and of course there's a big win in New Jersey a long time ago, and have been in court. And David, you mentioned how then for at least in New Mexico, we were back in court 6 times, which for this type of thing isn't enough. And yet here we are. It's 2015. Plaintiffs have been winning for a while. That makes me think, what does success in litigation actually look like here? So why hasn't more happened if we've been winning?
That's a very good question. That makes a lot of sense. Well, when plaintiffs win in these cases, then the spotlight shifts to the remedy. And the remedies are difficult in these cases. These are political remedies. You're going back to the legislature that caused the problem to begin with and telling them to fix it. Now, there have been some great remedies. That Washington State is a good example. They had a case long ago, 1978 they won, and there was a good remedy put in place. But over the years, there's been a lot of backsliding. The funding system was changed many times, so they went back to court, and they now have another decision that says, yes, the current system is unconstitutional and that needs to be fixed. So this is an area where I think the term eternal vigilance is probably appropriate, because this is a lot of money. It's a big, big portion of every state's budget, and there's always competition for that funding. And so there's a political interplay. The legislatures revisit the funding every year, or in some states every 2 years. So it's just an ongoing struggle. And of course the recession caused an enormous downturn in funding, and the states are not, even though they're recovering, they're not recovering in terms of, they're not putting the money back into their education budgets. So yes, it's an ongoing struggle, but a worthwhile one. And there are, I can, give, I don't want to go on and on, but I could give some, there have been some dramatic successes and some enormous increases in outcomes for low-income kids and in districts. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, so in Texas, I think we've been, at MALDEF, we became much more critical of this issue, and states winning cases, and then where was that money going? Because obviously more money was going to be put back into the system. And so in Texas, we made this, the strategic decision to file the adequacy case on behalf of only economically disadvantaged and English language learner students. And we did this for two reasons. One, because we got slammed on an adequacy decision in 2005 by our beautiful Texas Supreme Court, basically saying, oh, well, there's meaningful progress. Yeah, these kids aren't doing, so great on the whole, but overall we see some progress. And so we said, well, from an evidentiary perspective, let's go ahead and just focus on the economically disadvantaged and ELL students. And we saw that there was hardly any progress there, and even worse, there was some digress in the student achievement of those students as the standards had been raised and funding was cut. So it made for a better, stronger case. But we also thought, because we're thinking about the remedy on these cases, and the last time around in 2005, one of the sets of districts ended up winning their case, arguing that they were forced to tax at the maximum property tax rate just to provide a basic adequate education. So when it went to the legislature, what were they thinking? Oh, well, we got to cut taxes. And so that's what they ended up doing, was compressing tax rates. So they did put a little bit more money into the system, but they also made it more inequitable, which is why we ended up having to file the case back in 2011. And I think the litigants, particularly when they're civil rights groups, have to be much smarter and careful about this. The school districts that want to sue, they have their own self-interest, of course, right? But if you really want to make a much more profound impact, then you have to look at the remedy side. So if we get a ruling now, and it's possible, in Texas we have a 364-page, single-spaced page of findings of fact, conclusions of law. It's a stinging indictment of the Texas school finance system. And a large part of those findings was based on the performance or underperformance of economically disadvantaged and the ELL students. And when that case went up to the 9-member Republican elected Supreme Court just what was it, about six weeks ago or so, there were actually judges out there who were really concerned about these at-risk students and whether or not they were actually being provided the opportunities. So if we can get that more narrow ruling, if we get a general adequacy ruling, then that's fine, okay, but it's going to be a tough political fight. But if we get the more narrow ruling, because there were other groups who argued general adequacy claims in this lawsuit, but if we get that more narrow claim, then it gives us a lot more ammunition, because we can tell the legislature, hey, look, you know what? You don't have to just pour a whole bunch of more money into the system, but you do have to put more money into the education of these students. So that's what we're doing.
Well, I guess the mention of money brings me then to Kimberly. It's everyone likes money, and the proposal, as I take it, is as you say, put some strings on this money. It sounds like, though, in the state level litigation, where there have been successes and where there has been some follow through on remedy, I imagine part of that is money. And is there any reason to think that money from the federal government, with the sort of types of monitoring that you propose, would be different in kind and different in results from money that the legislature somewhat grudgingly provides? I mean, it's all money. Is the federal government behind it any different?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So, you know, I think what the key differences that I'm pushing for, and I think actually your prior question really supports why I think there should be some federal role in pushing states toward more equitable systems, is that in many ways, it's politically unpopular to change these systems. And just as you saw in Brown, what you see from the rich literature about Brown versus Board of Education through enforcement is that one of the reasons you had such successful resistance, including in Virginia, to the original Brown decisions is because the Supreme Court didn't provide cover to the federal courts to say, look, this court required we do exactly this, so we have to do it. I think in many ways, by having federal requirements for funding that the states are pretty substantially relying on, you get some cover for saying that this change to our state funding system is necessary for us to sustain our education system. So I think that can help to break through some of the political challenges that you face when you try to reform a funding system. And I think also the federal government has really a great track record with helping to disseminate research about what works best. So I think once we have kind of a national conversation about where we're headed with state funding systems, you also could devote research to, so what are the most effective ways to get there? Because one of the big challenges, so David's chart I thought was very illustrative of this, one of the big challenges we have is that funding is based on local property wealth and local property taxes. And that in itself, I don't know if any of you talked to others from other countries about our system, but when I've explained it to, people, I had a friend from Germany once talking with him about the system, and he said, so you built inequality into the system. Why did you do that? And I said it was here when I got here, basically. So that was really not my choice. But he was like, I don't understand why you would stack the odds against yourself of getting to equality when you base it on something that's so clearly unequal. Like you start from inequality and then you think, why didn't we get to an equal system? So I think that the federal government can help to research new ways to think about funding. I think we've clung to the ways we funded for too long. Even in the Rodriguez case in 1973, the Supreme Court said, I think that perhaps too long we have relied on property taxes and these have resulted in a variety of inequities. Greater equity is needed. And we've seen the laboratory of the states, I think in this case, really fail to get us where as a nation we need to be.
Well, if I could just sort of follow up on, and put these two questions together. I didn't write the number down quickly enough, but I thought you said something like $54 billion in federal funding already for education. And I imagine in these successes, again, if we wouldn't get quite that big because they're the feds and they've got more money. Why hasn't, I guess what I'm trying to understand is why hasn't that money made a difference? I mean, is it just that, I guess at either level, why hasn't it made more of a difference? Because I don't want to build in that it's made no difference at all. But if I go from $54 billion in federal funding to $108 billion in federal funding, I doubt I'm going to get double my oomph. So what's going on at a more granular level?
I'll respond to that. I'll let you. So partly the federal government has not actually required state funding systems to be equitable. They have very limited requirements, some in Title I that require funding to be comparable between districts. They have some supplement, not supplant provisions. Those were watered down in the 80s and have not been revived since. And so part of the problem is that the federal government hands out the money and doesn't have any substantial or robust requirements for states to have an equitable funding system that the feds are pouring money into. So we, in many ways, at the national level, we're pouring good money after bad. Now, it's not going to help the kids to withdraw the money because of that. I think what we need to do is leverage that more to get the results that we need as a nation. Well.
Well, the $54 billion is only about 10%. So the 6% in Virginia, sure, of the funds being spent on K-12 education. So it's not, it sounds like a big number, but it's only that smaller proportion. So there's only a certain amount of progress that can be made with that money. Now, when Title I first came in back in the 1960s, most of the money went to the most economically disadvantaged schools and districts. And that also has been watered down over the years, so it has less impact. You mentioned the report that we put out is School Funding Fair, and we have some graphs there that talk about, that show the equity or inequity, as you mentioned. And if you it's only state and local money. It doesn't include the federal money. If you include the federal money, those graphs become just ever so slightly more equitable. So it's not sent out in such a way that it has as big an impact as it could, even though it's only a small percentage. So I'll just add that. David?
Okay. We have about 10 minutes to open it up to you all. While you're thinking about questions, I want to ask one more provocative one, which comes up in any time there's social change litigation. There's a sort of symbiotic relationship between the public opinion and the and what courts do. And I was thinking about what Secretary Lehman said about the political will mattering the most. And is there a worry, or do you sometimes run into in litigating these cases that essentially, if there's a sense that the lawyers are taking care of it and then the courts are going to behind it, kind of do whatever needs to be done, that somehow detracts from the political will, or do you see that these actually coalesce together?
I think in the most successful cases, you will have the two wedded together. You will have litigation and the public campaign wedded together. We have done that. We've been terribly unsuccessful at that in some of our cases. Sometimes it doesn't matter, just because of the evidence that we have. And, school finance, frankly, I'm sure that you all were really excited to hear the first panel today was going to be on school finance. It's so totally freaking sexy. But,
money is important.
And, yeah, it's incredibly important. And when we talk to communities and they see the connection of the dots between school funding and class sizes and teacher quality and access to high quality pre-K, et cetera, then they start getting it. But oftentimes, frankly, we barely have the resources to litigate these types of cases, and those campaigns aren't quite so successful. Now, other times, despite having a very successful campaign like they did in Colorado, we represented interveners in that lawsuit on behalf of low-income and English language learner kids. There was also another group who had originally filed the lawsuit, a more general adequacy lawsuit, and they did have, a pretty decent public campaign where the public was really supporting it. The problem was the composition of the judges had changed between the time that the case was filed to when it was decided, and two of the conservative Democratic appointed judges had decided to kind of gut the standard that was there. And so sometimes, no matter, and we had I've practically never had, since I was at Legal Aid, I've never had such an overwhelming record just totally dominate a case. And then to have that public campaign saying, hey, yes, we need to change this. Our kids need access to the resources to achieve their potential. But then it gets defeated. So sometimes, it doesn't work out. But I will say that, ideally, you have the two working hand in hand.
Well, I will say that at least for me, it's enabled me to think about litigation, not just about winning and not just about the remedy, but as we've heard multiple times now, as about discovering what's actually going on in the world and putting together a case. And so I guess for our students out there, in civil litigation, discovery is a very powerful tool. But let's open it up to questions. Yes, ma'am.
Two movements of the last 20 years or so, vouchers and charter schools, have gained a little traction in a few places. Do you see either of those as a tool towards more educational equity, either in the present, in fact, or perhaps in the future?
Well, I think isn't there another panel that's going to discuss some of that? But I think that some of the proponents for those are arguing that education is the civil right and that they're going to make that civil right real through charters and or vouchers. I haven't seen that yet. There's a lot of variety in what's happening out there, but I really haven't seen more equity. I think that Secretary Lehman talked about pushing kids out, and that seems to be happening a lot. And I know we have a Preston Green will be speaking this afternoon, and he's done a lot of research in that area. So I should just stop there.
I will say, from my perspective, that they are just distractions. Vouchers mean that the public is no longer willing to invest in the public schools where they are. Vouchers are only going to reach certain students in certain communities. They're not going to be in rural communities, for example. They're not going to be in other urban communities, in certain urban communities, or they're going to have to, trek, from 6 a.m. and not get home until 6 p.m. Largely the charter school movement as well. Certainly there are some charter schools that are excellent. There are a lot of charter schools that are very pitiful. There are charter schools that have increased segregation of students as well. And so why are we shifting public attention? Why are we shifting all the attention away from, adequately and equitably funding schools and providing opportunities to students, away from these very piecemeal approaches that haven't been shown to be more effective and provide those equitable opportunities at the end of the day? I just think that it's a real travesty, because now we're just talking about, firing teachers and closing schools rather than, supporting schools and trying to help make them better.
I'll comment on that as well. So I think actually vouchers and charters are really symptomatic of the fact that we are failing in our public schools. You want an exit for your child, and you want an exit for your child now. And you want a better school and a better education for your child now. And so I think, as someone who works on education law and policy and seeks to make the public schools better, all public schools, I think it's hard to say to a parent, well, you might be your child who's only going to have one shot in education. You can't take advantage of something that may work for your child. Now, I don't think it works for everyone. There are great charters and there are bad charters. The label charter, just like the label Montessori, doesn't really convey what's happening in the school. It's all about what's actually going on in that building. So I think David captured it well. There are great charters and there are terrible charters and there are mediocre charters, and that's true for regular public schools. But I think it's very disingenuous when we have not, as a nation, invested in our public schools to be excellent and to have equitable outcomes for all children, to then say to parents today that you can't try to exercise an option that helps your child. And I say that as a parent of 2 school-age children myself. If we didn't have the means to be where we want our children to be, you better believe I'd jump at a chance to put them somewhere, because I want the best for them. And I think to deny that to parents, while all of us within the realm of reform and state legislatures fail to provide what they need, I think trapping kids and not giving them a better option is a difficult thing. I think what we need to do is make the public schools better so that you don't need an escape valve, that you're drawing people from the private sector back in. But we're not doing that right now. So the idea that you're going to wait until we fix the system and force kids to just sit there till we do that, I think it's just not fair to them. So.
Yes, sir, in front.
If you look at where we are in Virginia, where we're running schools, we're 14.5% down from where we were in 2009. This 100 organization points out that we have a B for effort. We're the 10th wealthiest state in the nation, and we're about 38, 39, depends on who you look to, somewhere between 38th and 41st in the state support for our schools. Ms. Hunter's group points out that we fail in the way we distribute our money in Virginia. And her group points out that we are last in the nation, 51st, in offering a competitive teacher salary. But I sat at Senate Finance Committee yesterday and listened to Jay Lark present their hurried report because they were told, you must rush, you must rush, you must rush. And the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, whose district we're in right now, Senator Walter Stodge, he said afterwards, well, I can't believe we're spending less on education now than we were in 2009. I just don't believe that. So you know, I mean, I think we're in a world where there's a deliberate obfuscation of the facts by our leaders. You know, and my frustration level is through the ceiling. And I guess my question is, how do we break through that?
I think one of the ways that you break through it, if you look at the data on achievement for Virginia, if you take off Northern Virginia and you look at the rest of the state, we look a lot like Alabama, right? Which Virginians don't think of. Virginians think of themselves actually quite highly, which I think is not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing, but I think that we have a distorted view of our education system and the excellence of our education system. Because you have this highly educated population concentrated right around the capital, mostly, you know, going into the kind of variety of federal workforce, Congress, all that, you need to disaggregate the data and really look at how students are doing around the state. I think that we will get some really stark realities that cannot be denied. But when you do averages, so this was the beauty of No Child Left Behind, right? You stopped looking at averages for schools and disaggregated how English language learners, how disabled students, how African American students. You broke down the data, you stopped looking at averages, then you get a real picture. But as long as you say, oh, X number of, you know, I don't have the figures right on top of my head, but X number of Virginians go to college every year. Yeah, take off Northern Virginia and you drop down even, you know, further. So you want to, I think part of the way to paint a compelling picture is to disaggregate the data and break it down across the state. Southwest Virginia particularly, really difficult, you know, and concerning achievement levels that need to be addressed.
I think a critical component that needs to be added to that, though, because otherwise it's still those kids in those schools, in those communities, right? Why should it matter to me? Is tying the economic interest for, you know, the state in general and even for the more affluent community, and letting them know, well, you know, when you have this, and not to say that there's a school to prison pipeline just because kids aren't educated they're going to go to prison, right? I think that's very deficit-minded, and that's where we need to get beyond. But the fact is that when you look at prison populations, a lot of them are school dropouts. A lot of them have come from communities that have been under-resourced. And it's critical that you get, you know, whether it's from a demographer standpoint, talking about, you know, what is the cost to the state, you know, in welfare, in criminal, in healthcare, et cetera, to the state if they fail to educate these students, versus what is the benefits of, you know, providing an adequate education for all students, because it's a night and day thing. And we did that in the Texas school finance case, by the way, and we continue to pour that information in front of the legislature, and we call them basically the fear factor witnesses, you know, because they scare the living bejesus out of, you know, even your most conservative people, because they don't realize, you know, these demographic changes. A lot of times people look at them, well, we've got more ELL students, we've got more low-income students, you know. Those are great opportunities. We have, with ELL students, those are potentially bilingual students in this global world, you know, and with low-income students, you know, people who can survive and make the most of that, that's a lot of grit and determination that is built in those students to come out and achieve. So I just wanted to add that I think the economic component is a critical piece.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, there's a book entitled The Price We Pay, and it talks about the various costs and benefits of investing in education and not investing, and in great detail by experts from around the nation writing the different chapters. So if you want to get into more of that, you can do that. So.
Well, I'd like to thank our panelists, because in the interest of intertemporal equity toward other panels, I asked you to stick around for innovation, which is coming up. But join me in thanking our panelists for our